Welcome to another one of Mr. Lang's virtual classrooms. Today, we are taking a look at the War for Independence. Again, the American Revolution, one of the most pivotal moments in our nation's history. Again, when we have the 13 United Colonies of America, which will eventually become the 13 United States. And then, of course, versus Great Britain. Again, those tensions we've been talking about with the French and Indian War, again, have culminated into this. But how did we even get here? Well, don't forget, some colonists were just straight up not happy with a formal protest of all those taxes we were talking about. They wanted more direct action. And so people like Sam Adams are going to go ahead and help create the Sons of Liberty to take more of an active role against England and their policies and their taxation. And the most effective protest really was boycotting or essentially refusing to buy their goods. Sometimes they used unfortunate violence, such as burning a tax collector's home or tarring and feathering, which is horrible stuff. But essentially, that's how they got their message across back then. Now, what a boycott means is essentially you do not buy products from a business as a way of getting what you want. So in this case, they didn't want, again, to be taxed. And so they decide, no, we are not going to go ahead and buy your products, especially things like, most famously, tea. So, Boston Massacre occurs March 5th, 1770. And this really does kind of essentially take this whole situation and put it into overdrive. Essentially what happened is there was a protest outside the Massachusetts, outside the State House, located in Boston, Massachusetts, and it started as a protest against the British government by colonists. And let's be serious here. Colonists weren't innocent. Okay, they were throwing snowballs, and this was a snowy, March, and it was cold. So they were more like ice balls that they were throwing at these soldiers. They were taunting them. They were calling them names, and the soldiers suddenly fired on the crowd, killing 5 colonists, unarmed colonists. To this day, we don't know what happened, who gave the order. We don't think anyone gave the order. In fact, we think that in all the chaos and the yelling that someone had fired and the rest followed suit. In the end, Paul Revere, who was a member of the Sons of Liberty, goes ahead, writes about the event, and also etches it in the very famous Bloody Massacre, which becomes known as the Boston Massacre. And you can see that in the bottom left-hand corner. That is what people saw. And because that's what they saw, and that's going to be spread throughout the colonies, people are going to want to essentially go ahead and take action. Now, the first person killed was Crispus Attucks, who was an African American at the time, as you can see here now in the center. And John Adams, who will be the future president, is going to be defending the British troops in court following the massacre. And when he does, 6 of those soldiers are acquitted, and the other 2 are convicted of manslaughter. And that just goes to show that John Adams was a fantastic lawyer. He really was. However, he does kind of get a lot of ridicule for that. So as you can see from the etching, it definitely is a little bit more swayed towards, inciting essentially a revolution. You could definitely tell when Paul Revere etched this thing that he had one thing on his mind, and that was to go ahead and essentially exploit the situation to get the colonies to go ahead and unite against Britain. Did it really look like this? Probably not. They probably weren't all lined up real nice. They were, again, don't forget they were, they're hitting the British with snowballs as well, and rocks and things like that. And yet, this is a random dog. Just a random dog. It's just, again, it's a little over exaggerated, but to get people's attention. The next very famous event is the Boston Tea Party, where colonists dress up as Native Americans and they toss British tea, boom, into Boston Harbor. Now, it's not the only incident. There are many incidents of this throughout the colonies. This just becomes the most famous one. And that's because, well, the British, the king really, this one got his attention all right. Because don't forget, Boston was the rebel rousers. We were the ones that were literally going ahead and starting this thing. Essentially, at certain points, they're going to want to cut Massachusetts off from the rest of the other colonies because they think that we're like a disease, that we're just going to go ahead and just be contagious and spread our ideas, which we did. But they wanted to go ahead and cut us off so we wouldn't do that. And it just, at that point, it wasn't possible. But things like the Pony Express, it just wasn't going to happen. Everything goes, messages were traveling pretty quickly for the time across the colonies, especially when it had to do with this. Now, this whole Tea Party was meant to be a message to the British saying we're going to continue to boycott your goods, again, due to your high taxation without representation in Parliament in England. To think of what Parliament is, it's essentially a legislative group. It's very similar to how we have Congress today in the United States. It's very similar to that they have over there. So the colonists object to all the different acts: Stamp Act, Bordering Act, Townshend Act, Tea Act, Intolerable Acts, ones we're going to get more into a little bit later on in more detail, mainly because it threatened the colonists' power of self-government. And that really is what they wanted. Again, this was, they wanted to be self-governed. They grew out of being the kid under Great Britain. They wanted to be all grown up and moved out of the house. And that's exactly how they're going to approach these situations. And of course, very famously, the shot heard round the world, Lexington and Concord in 1775. This really is the first fighting of the war. The Patriots, who again are these colonists, are going to go ahead. They're going to store arms and ammunition in Concord. And the British were like, whoa, that's British property. We're going to go ahead. We're going to come down. We're going to take that real quick. And so they go ahead and they had a mission that day. They go ahead on April 18th, and they were to capture arms and ammunition and two patriots that were very much inciting a lot of riots and such, a lot of protesters, and a lot of all this anti-British sentiment. And that is Sam Adams and John Hancock. The British march out of Boston on April 18th, 1775. And these patriots, Paul Revere, William Dawes, Samuel Prescott, they ride to warn the countryside of the British, and they say the regulars are out. Yeah. So I know we all know, very famously, right? Paul Revere said the British are coming, but he did not. In fact, it would make no sense why he would say that. They're all British. So again, because of Henry Longfellow's poem, that everyone thinks that's what he said, but it's not true at all. In fact, that's the only reason why I really talk about Paul Revere, because the other guys also were just as influential. And Paul Revere ended up getting caught too, before he made it all the way out on his whole journey. But yes, he instead said, all of them said, the regulars are out. The regulars are out. The regulars meaning the British, and they're out because they're out of Boston. They're coming. So the regulars are out. They go and they say the regulars are out. And the Lexington, the Minutemen go ahead and confront the British. For the first time, they confront. Now they exchange fire. This is that shot heard around the world. Nobody knows who shot first. Again, we still don't have a clue. If it was the British who fired the first shot, if it was the colonists that fired the first shot, we don't know. But what we do know is that this was, all the smoke cleared, we had 18 Minutemen killed or wounded, and this war was underway. So the British march from Lexington to Concord over the North Bridge. They destroy supplies along the way, still exchanging fire. All the while, there's a lot of guerrilla warfare fighting that the Minutemen are doing, because that's what they've been trained to do, because it's their land. They can duck behind trees. They've seen the Native Americans do it, while the British are literally wearing their red coats, sticking out all formal in a line. So the British march back to Boston. The Minutemen fire on the British the entire way, like I said, using that guerrilla warfare and through the trees. They're going to have altogether 300 British killed, wounded, or missing. And after this battle, people who become loyal to the king are going to be referred to as loyalists in the country. And it's kind of insane, because the colonies now, there's no turning back. They fired those shots. And yet, they had a chance to go ahead. We'll talk about that. A chance to get out of this. So there's the routes right there. We got Paul Revere in blue, William Dawes in green, and Dr. Samuel Prescott and his route in purple. And of course, you can see where some of the British patrols were and how they essentially avoided the British patrols until, of course, they got caught. Again, it was Prescott that was able to go and, go all the way out past Lexington and Concord, which was impressive there. So again, they're just screaming, "Hey, the regulars are out! The regulars are out!" And of course, you see the beautiful painting that came out of this as well. That's the Old North Church, right? One by land, two by sea, right? And of course, here's some of that first fighting that we see in Lexington. And then, of course, in Concord over the North Bridge, the Old North Bridge. And there you go. More fighting here. We have intense fighting here. So the Second Continental Congress in 1775 meets with representatives from the colonies to go ahead and essentially discuss what plans were. So they meet in Philadelphia, and when they do, they go ahead and they draft up the Olive Branch Petition. Now, the Olive Branch Petition is really essentially sending this petition to King George III, asking to restore peace, essentially saying, hey, things were a little out of hand in Lexington and Concord. If things cool down, we're cool. We're gonna be cool, right? Here you go. All right. We just, stop the taxes, and then maybe we'll, won't have any more war, no more fighting. The king obviously refused. He refused the petition, and so the Continental Army is formed. They create an army to prepare for war under the command of General George Washington. Again, one of his finest moments. And this army is going to use those guerrilla warfare tactics during battles. Again, really taking those tactics that Washington had seen the Native Americans use against him, the French use against him at Fort Necessity, and now he's going to go ahead and use that against the British. Will he be successful? We'll have to find out. Stay tuned here. Stay tuned. Famously, we've got the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. The American army surrounded Boston after Lexington and Concord. Again, they definitely wanted to go ahead and cut off, at this point, they had to cut off Boston from the rest. So the British Army attacks the rebels to drive them back. In fact, they're beaten back twice, though. The British are actually beaten back twice. And the rebels, on the third wave, actually run out of ammo. Yeah, unfortunately. So they were forced to retreat on that third wave. We have altogether 2,200 British start the battle. 1,000 are going to be killed or wounded, give or take. You can see the blue is where colonists are, and then the red is the British and the ships there, and they're going to be sailing right on it. Now that right there, that's what it is. Right off I-93. There you go. There's your Bunker Hill. And of course, to kind of show you what essentially happened, you have, again, right here on Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. Again, it's kind of weird because a lot of the fighting happened on Breed's Hill, yet we just refer to it as Bunker Hill as the battle as a whole. And so, of course, the British sail over the Charles. They land there. They go and they attack. And, well, they get pushed back once. They go and attack again. They get pushed back twice. They attack on the third wave. They run out of ammo. And they push the colonists back. They had to retreat. There you go. There you go. So now the colonists start to take action. Again, Thomas Paine writes very famously the pamphlet Common Sense in 1776, arguing for American independence. Most Americans are going to read this pamphlet and agree with him that yes, it's just common sense. We've outgrown the British Empire and we would be much more successful on our own. And of course, that's what he writes in there. Another huge document, one of the most important ones in our history, is the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson and edited by John Adams and Ben Franklin, amongst a few others. They're the main editors. It's issued by the Second Continental Congress in July of 1776 and read throughout the colonies. Now, what did this Declaration of Independence say? Well, first, we're declaring our independence from the British, and we're creating a new nation called the United States of America, USA. So, this is no surprise all of this is going down. This is all during the Enlightenment period, which is going on throughout the world. Now, Thomas Jefferson's a well-traveled man. He's been to other countries in Europe who are going through this Enlightenment period where we have people who are essentially really kind of rethinking the social structure of, well, the world, including things like monarchs. why do we have monarchs? And in fact, that's where we see a lot of these ideas that they go ahead and he has in this document is from the Enlightenment period, where people really were looking at different government systems, different ways of doing things, and saying, well, maybe we need to change it. And of course, that's why we have a huge representative government here. Is a lot of it is because of the Enlightenment period, where we have people like Baron de Montesquieu, who said, hey, let's have a representative government with 3 branches. And of course, we have John Locke, which is a huge influence for Thomas Jefferson, saying that, again, if a government isn't really going ahead and supporting you in any way, you have the right to overthrow it. So the purpose of the document as a whole was to break ties with England and basically create the U.S. The purpose of the government was to protect the rights, liberties of the people, and, well, the British government was not doing that, and that's what he argued. In fact, really, when you look at the Declaration of Independence, it's a whole list of stuff that the king should have been, complaints against the king and what he should have been doing. The power he believes in this document is huge, where he says it comes from the people, not from a monarch who claims, in some cases that they're divine right, they're, got their rights from God, but it's not hereditary, it's from the people. Now, unfortunately, the reality is the ideas did not apply to slaves, women, Native Americans, and free blacks. Unfortunately, we are going to see that these are groups that are going to struggle, and they are going to, fight and claw their way to gain those rights. And when they do gain those rights, heck, they earn them. They earn those rights. And we're going to be talking about that throughout our entire US 1 curriculum, on how these groups really, well, they had it rough, to put it bluntly. And so, of course, unfortunately, they weren't included in this vision yet. And they're going to pave their own way. And unfortunately, we're going to see that's going to take a while. All right, so common sense, do throw some quotes there. 1776 talks about problems in the monarchy. Here's a ton of them, according to Thomas Paine. And T. Paine says, monarchy and secession have laid, not this with that kingdom only, but the world in blood and ashes. 'Tis a form of government which the word of God bears testimony against. Big words. And then, why should America be independent? But from the errors of other nations let us learn wisdom, lay hold of the present opportunity to begin government at the right end. Independence is the only bond that can tie and keep us together. And talking about the colonies. Again, the cause of America is, in a great measure, the cause of all mankind. Fantastic, right? Fantastic. And of course, some of the most famous words are in that Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Unfortunately, it should read all men and women of all status and color. However, I digress. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which John Locke, the Enlightenment thinker, said life, liberty, and property. Again, a little plagiarism there, Thomas Jefferson. Chummy J, it's alright, but it is what it is. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving that their just powers from the consent of the governed. Meaning, the power we get, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, it's the government that secures these rights. And that, of course, that's where we derive, the power should be driven through us, through people, not the monarchies, not the government. And whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these means, it is the right of the people to alter it or abolish it. Oof. And to institute new government. Oh, so good. So good. So, we do have the Continental Army, and in the beginning, the Continental Army was just made up of frontiersmen, farmers, townspeople who left their homes to fight the British, many of whom believed the war would be just a short one. At first, they had to provide their own weapons, their own ammo, their own uniforms, because it just, well, not only wasn't there enough, there wasn't any money to be had either. And over time, they would be formed into regular units with uniforms and proper equipment, and the French would also help out big time, especially following the Battle of Saratoga, which is the turning point of this war. That battle is such a big one in this war. The Battle of Saratoga that happens in Saratoga, New York, really does turn the tide of this war completely. And the French finally say, all right, colonists may have a chance. Let's get in there and help them out. So reasons why the American colonists believed that they would win the war, and reasons why most people believe that England would win the war. We have advantages and disadvantages on each side. First, advantages for the colonists are, of course, they're fighting for their homes, their families, their freedom, their land. That's something that's big into them. They're not just fighting for a government because they enlisted. George Washington, he's an advantage. He's a huge advantage. He's an incredible advantage. He's an amazing advantage. They're fighting on their own home turf. Think about it. They know the land better than anybody else. Than these people who just came off the boat and just landed here in Boston are just like, oh yeah, this is what Boston looks like. Ben Franklin, he's going to go ahead and get the French to help out. Again, we know Britain and France has a huge rivalry, like the Red Sox and the Yankees, and that's exactly what we see here. Again, the French is more or less like, well, we don't really care about your whole U.S. there, but we really want to beat the British because we just lost a 7 years war not too long ago. And if we have the chance to go ahead and beat the British, oh, fantastic. That's what we want to do. It's the only reason why. Many of the English generals were afraid to make mistakes versus more or less the colonists, the militiamen. Those generals are going to go ahead and the Continental Army are, they're going to be able to take risks because they're learning on the job. And the English people would get tired of war, and they would. I mean, the war is very draining on lives and, of course, on money. So the people of Great Britain are not going to be a fan of that at all. Now, disadvantages, of course, they have a poorly trained army. They didn't have a navy, so that's big, considering the British have one of the biggest navies in the world. They have no money to fight a war. There's just no money in the colonies. They're not the British. They don't have that money. They're weak. Their government's inexperienced. Very weak and inexperienced government. These for some of them, this is the first time they're figuring out again, right on the job. You have 2/3 of the population are Tories, or what we call loyalists, who didn't care. Who just didn't care. So you have either loyalists who are loyal to the crown, or people who just didn't care about the movement. So that's 2/3. That's a lot. Again, the English army they're professional. They're a professional army. They're going to be hiring Hessians, who are mercenaries. They're going to be hiring Native Americans to be against them. They're going to have poor equipment. They're going to lack food. Again, soldiers literally could go ahead and leave at will. It didn't make any sense looking at this list. Again, between advantages and disadvantages, the disadvantages are, it's a big list. It's a big list. So reasons why England believed they would win this war with America, and reasons why England might not win the war. So first off, England, again, had that professional army and navy. They had factories to make war materials. They had money to feed and supply an army. They had a government to make decisions. They had 1/3 of the American population as Tories. So again, they had a lot of support here. Hessians and Native Americans on the British side, and Americans were poorly supplied, poorly trained in some cases too. Disadvantages, of course, England had 3,000-mile supply line. Again, the one big advantage here is that the colonists are on their own land. Again, there's a whole Atlantic Ocean. It's quite a big pond between Great Britain and the colonies, and they had to go ahead and use that supply line. English soldiers were fighting because they were told to fight. American is a large piece of land. America's big, and it's not easy to control or conquer. Think about how big those 13 colonies were versus how big, just England was at the time. And many of the English generals were afraid to make mistakes. Again, they had a big, they're very, very much into discipline and everything else. So at the end of the day, you make a mistake, that could be, sorry, now you're out of, you don't have general anymore. So again, as I said before, just to restate, Battle of Saratoga becomes a turning point in the war. The French do begin to aid the colonists, the Americans, after this, really because General Burgoyne, who was a huge general on the British, surrendered to the Americans with about 7,000 soldiers. Ben Franklin, who was living in France at the time, was able to convince the French to help the Americans due to this victory. He was in the right time at the right place at the right time. And we have the Battle of Yorktown. That's the end of the war. That's it. The American and French armies defeated the British at the Battle of Yorktown. General Cornwallis surrenders, and this marks the end. The Treaty of Paris is signed, and, we're now the United States, and we have to now put our money where our mouth was and make a country. Very famously, of course, as a big fan of Alexander Hamilton. This is one of his big victories here at Yorktown, as he does lead a regiment to capture a redoubt, which is pretty incredible. Again, very famously too, I should say, the world turned upside down. It was seen all along different newspapers. Now, Cornwallis didn't actually want to meet with Washington to surrender. In fact, that was very controversial. He sent a second in command because, of course, he was very embarrassed for losing. They were cornered at Yorktown, Virginia here. Again, they had the French were out at sea. Again, had them cornered. Literally, Cornwallis had his back to the sea here. You can see the troops were just closing in around them. They had literally no chance. Cornwallis had to surrender, and that's it. Again, thank you for joining me on this whole journey of the American Revolution. And what's going to happen next with this country is something that we still have to go ahead and create it. Now that we won the war, we've gone over that hurdle, we have a lot more we've got to do. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you guys back in the classroom.